Great. Well, happy Thursday, everyone. Hope those of you in the Carolinas and Virginia are getting a lot of water and staying out of this oppressive heat today. Um, this gives you at least an hour to stay inside with the air conditioning for sure. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dupre Jones. I'm the current president of ISM's affiliate here for the Carolinas and Virginia, representing North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. You've come to our June webinar at the end of our programming year. We are in a July to June timeframe, and we're thrilled to wrap up our 24-25 year with a few leaders here in the procurement space. I want to first just share with you a little bit about, we're going to be talking about scientific procurement, and I'm going to let our guest speakers talk about what that is. And then we can understand a little bit more about where they came from, what the problems that they saw out in the marketplace, and then how they've been able to help solve that and move this special category in procurement to the next level. First, I want to introduce our primary speaker here, Nick Premnath. Nick is he spent the last 15 years at the intersection of life sciences and technology, helping organizations modernize how they operate and procure critical research supplies. With a background in management consulting at Deloitte, deep experience leading commercial strategy for tech-enabled procurement platforms, Nick now heads a commercial team at Labviva. At Labviva, he partners with pharmaceutical, biotech, and academic institutions to streamline catalog buying, improve data transparency, and reduce the complexity of scientific procurement. So Nick, welcome. We're really glad to have you here today.
Great. Thanks, Dupre, and great to meet everyone. And thanks for that well thought of introduction. Really excited to talk today about sort of what we're seeing in the market, and some of the new models that we're working with many of our customers on. With me in today's conversation, I do have one of our longtime partners, Todd Sells, has a number of years in this space. Todd, if you don't mind, it might be good just to do a quick intro on yourself to everyone on the line.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Sells, and I've been involved in, a variety of different industries, actually, but in more recent years, biotech, clinical research organizations, and pharmaceutical organizations helping scientists do science. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about some of those activities and major projects that I was involved in while working with the team at Labviva, and hopefully give you a better understanding of some of the intricacies of that, some of those processes and how we go about it, as well as the newer technologies that are now available out there to help make this process more effective and more efficient. So with that, and I've got a background in chemistry, a PhD in chemistry and a master's degree in supply chain management. Thank you.
Oh, man, I got to go back to school if I'm going to compete with you, Todd, with all those letters behind your name. That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad you're here. One of the questions I want to try to ask is, we're looking at scientific procurement, Nick and Todd, but we're also looking at inventory. We're looking at inventory of materials. Perhaps can you help us let's get a historical picture of where were we and where are we now in this space?
Yeah, we can definitely cover that. But Dupre, if we want to cover that sort of off the top of the conversation, I think as we think about like inventory of both chemicals and materials, it's primarily being done, in a multiple different ways, specifically in the life sciences space. As we think about like materials, you're typically using, some legacy technology, whether that's, larger procurement and ERP tools to manage inventory, or, in the life sciences space, a lot of the vendors themselves have inventory management solutions. But again, these are not agnostic solutions. These are actually controlled and owned by the vendor itself, sort of deepening the relationship and, some of the visibility that the vendor has versus the customer. Todd, I don't know if there's anything else that you would want to add there.
Yeah, I would just say that in general, to run a major organization like a pharmaceutical company from a laboratory perspective, right? There's a tremendous diversity of different items that people need to purchase, to use. And then once it's used up, you've got that life cycle of getting rid of, whatever might be left from it, all in, a regulated environment in many cases. And so there's a lot of complexity, a lot of money that's wrapped up, not just in the products, but in terms of the scientists, right? When I was at Takeda, we had, PhDs from Harvard and MIT and places of that nature. So, as a more of a supporting function from a procurement standpoint, you want to keep these people effective and efficient at what they do, just from a financial standpoint, if nothing else, right? And then there's also about, having their environment be a good place for them to work, so they're happy and they stay with your company, because it's a very competitive industry for talent. So historically, this has been managed a lot of times, and we'll get into it more, by a couple of the large distributors that are out there for scientific supplies. So the two largest are the Thermo Fisher Scientific Organization and Avantor, which also has the brand VWR underneath it. And those are really the two big players in the marketplace. They come in and deliver these products to people, and they oftentimes will do additional services on site in terms of inventory management. They do it all for the customer. The challenge for the customer has been, is the service good or not? And also, when we're bundling products and services together from a procurement strategy perspective, am I getting the value that I should get, as part of this industry? And we'll talk more about that as time goes on. But that's one of the challenges, right? So you're trading off convenience versus cost, and unbundling that so you can have a better look at it, understand it better, and make the appropriate decisions on behalf of your company.
Well, it sounds like, Todd, I never really thought about these researchers wanting to leave somewhere that doesn't give them the tools that they need to do their work. That's fascinating. It's one thing sometimes we just focus on the products that we're trying to procure without understanding the holistic impacts of it. And it sounds like it doesn't just apply to pharma companies themselves, but like we talked about in IXBio, the academic research is no different than when you talked about from the Harvard and MITs and the like. When they're doing their own clinical trials under research grants, they need to have the right tools, the right equipment to meet the scopes of their trials at whatever phase they're in. So it sounds like, Todd, from what you were telling me, there's a lot of other nuances to this type of work.
And so, the scientists really were trained to be scientists, right? And they end up getting involved in, I got to look and see what I'm going to need for my experiments. You think about it like you're baking a cake, right? I need some flour, I need some sugar, I need, whatever it might be, right? And they got to figure out how to get this stuff, right? Or they have to explain the requirements to someone so someone else can get those products for them on behalf of them, right? And so there's a lot of research and time involved in that, plus worrying about your budgets. Do you have enough money in order to buy what you need to perform the experiment you need to do? And so it ends up taking more time than ideally people would like. And so that's part of the challenge, is to try to streamline these processes, right? That historically hadn't been given as much thought as they probably should. And you multiply that out by sometimes having thousands of scientists operating every day like this, and the numbers can add up in terms of those efficiencies.
Wow. Yeah. It's almost like then getting ready, also preparing a production line.
Yes.
Space.
It's similar. The primary difference is, in a research environment, you have a much broader diversity of items you need, versus a manufacturing environment. You end up with your bill of materials typically, right? And so you're going to have a recipe of things you need to add in to execute manufacturing the product. And that's more limited in scope, right, than research, which changes day to day, week to week, month to month.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, now that we've uncovered this, Nick, how did Labviva come into existence and within the confines of what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I think what the real genesis of Labviva is our two founders actually worked for the large distributors in the e-commerce space. And really, when they were part of working for those larger distributors, primarily selling into large biopharma, large medical device companies, their main focus was to get them into their, get the buyer, in this case, most likely a scientist or someone as a buyer within the procurement organization, into their e-commerce website, typically through a punch out integration within
Right.
the procurement system.
Right.
So the genesis of Labviva was, because, most of these buyers, most of these scientists, to Todd's point, for ease of use, they're just entering into an e-commerce punch out to, a Vantor or Thermo. They're
Right.
really not getting true fair market value for that particular product or service that they were procuring. And the genesis of Labviva was really focused on how do we, have visibility and transparency into what the market is offering for a particular product, and making sure that you are actually competing for that, business on every transaction by, being able to purchase with those distributors or directly to those manufacturers, or even work with other smaller distributors that might be offering more advantageous pricing. And that's really the first sort of genesis of Labviva, is providing a technology that allows you to have visibility into those pricings without, impeding on the scientist's productivity, ease of use, and things like that.
So I guess another thing to keep that I was just thinking about is something that Todd mentioned, is that, and I think each of you mentioned this, is a lot of these vendors would end up, a lot of these vendors like your VWR and Thermo would have their own proprietary catalogs. How does Labviva, where does Labviva fit into within this? How would someone try to navigate Labviva versus these other catalogs?
Yeah, so we play with all the major distributors, we play with all the major manufacturers, and then in terms of catalogs, nothing really changes in terms of, Labviva isn't a marketplace, it's actually a technology. So we're actually just surfacing the pre-negotiated rates that you might have with a particular vendor, and we surface that catalog that you have with that vendor onto a technology. But then what we do is we normalize that data via the manufacturing part number. So you can see, what a pipette with a particular manufacturing part number costs from that, potentially your prime distributor, a tertiary distributor, and potentially a direct manufacturer, all within one experience, so that it has no impact to the scientist in terms of having to competitively search for, a low dollar cost item. They can just search for a pipette, and then they would see all the options available. And again, that would all be pivoted based off of the manufacturing part number that is associated with that particular SKU.
So it sounds like you're augmenting or just adding on to this catalogs to make it easier to find, ease of use, but then also perhaps some benchmarking, or just trying to think, okay, this SKU and this SKU are pretty similar. Are you sure you only want this one?
Exactly. And then as we think about like the AI piece of this, 5 years ago, our CTO implemented functionality with the platform that actually scrapes the internet for, published papers that have cited any of those products. So beyond just the normal sort of punch out experience and getting a description of the product, we're using, verified information sources to enrich the data set on the buying experience, so that not only can I find a particular, product on our platform and find, all the costing options and channels that might be available to my organization, we're also supplementing that with information that is helpful for scientists to make a purchasing decision.
So it's helping them understand perhaps where there are defects with this product. You may want to avoid this pipette using the same product you're talking about, and go with a different one.
Yep, it's defects as well as like use cases of how that particular product was used for a particular study.
Interesting. Yeah, this is good. By the way, just for a little housekeeping, if you do have questions for those who are here, please put them in the chat, and then we'll get to them in just a little while. But from that perspective, if we've talked a lot about kind of some of the theoretical and the conceptual and some of the challenges out there. Todd, can you help us go through maybe kind of a day in the life of some of your world as you've seen this situation appear in real life, and kind of reflect on that, or help us understand a little bit how it works out with someone in your role?
Yeah, let me give you maybe an example of some real world things that happened as while we were at Takeda. So when we started working in this space with Labviva and continued to evolve the platform and the capabilities, I already had it implemented when we got hit with COVID, right? And during COVID in the scientific area, there were a number of products that were difficult to get. They weren't always predictable which ones were going to be difficult to get. And so what would typically happen is, you place an order for a product, and there can be literally millions of different products people might need depending upon the situation. And you wouldn't know if you were going to get, everyone takes your order, okay, but you just didn't know if they were going to deliver it for you or if it was on back order, those kinds of things. And what was really helpful for Takeda and helped us in many hundreds of cases that I'm aware of, is that we could not get a product from our primary distributor who would normally supply us a product, because in some cases we're put on allocation, right? They said, this is the maximum amount we can sell you because of the high demand. So we got stuck, and we had manufacturing plants that would have literally been shut down for not having a part. And in the pharmaceutical area, obviously we're creating life-saving drugs, right? So you got to make sure you can get those drugs to patients that need them when they need them. And also, it's extremely expensive from a financial standpoint to have an idle plant going not manufacturing product, right? So we had a very serious situation, and the Labviva, because of their technology and how they've applied this, right? And Nick talked about manufacturing part numbers. There's also something that we typically refer to as a distributor part number. So the distributor or the manufacturer, they create their part number, okay? And if you're a distributor, typically you have your own part number, and that is linked to a manufacturing part number. But oftentimes, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry, the distributors don't share the manufacturing part number with you. But the Labviva technology had the correlations between the manufacturing part numbers, as Nick said, and those distributor part numbers. So in the cases where I always bought a product from, let's say, Thermo Fisher Scientific, now I had the ability to see on the screen who are the other suppliers that can provide that product. So from a supply assurance perspective, it was absolutely critical for us to have this technology and be, we were a leader in this area, and we were fortunate to have this in place when COVID hit, and that helped us in many different cases. So that was far beyond the price of admission in terms of just saving money, but actually keeping operations running.
Wow. Well, and it sounds like, for me, it sounds a little bit like the whole concept that folks like, it's easy to just go with one source and one partner and it be enough. But oftentimes what we're seeing, COVID taught a lot of us now to have a dual source or a multi-source strategy when it came to, well, heck, in my world in logistics, you couldn't just have UPS or FedEx out there. 2 years ago, you were going to be really out of luck come July 2023 if you only had UPS with the Teamsters striking, right? Or if you only imported out of LA Long Beach 5 years ago, you're going to be in real trouble because nothing was going in or out. But it sounds like even from what you're talking about, Todd, here is that leveraging Labviva plus going with a dual source distribution strategy allows you to pivot or kind of pivot or go with alternatives to mitigate risk.
Right, absolutely. And we could start to then monitor, what are we purchasing from each of these suppliers? Who's doing a good job delivering for us in a reasonable time frame, right? And so we became less dependent. We're still dependent, of course, on the major distributors, right? But, I think a lot of people have seen, and I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I would surmise that in many cases, people had 80+% of their purchases in this area going through one of the two distributors. As you start to utilize this technology and think more holistically about your supply chain, supply assurance, and competitive elements and all of this, you can start to whittle that down. And maybe the ideal ratio should be more like 50%, right? Or 60% rather than 80%. So you've now saved some money. You've increased the robustness, right, of your supply chain, and you've put your company in a much lower risk situation than you were before.
Sure. Oh, wow. Yeah. So I'm hearing definitely risk management, supplier assurance, like we were talking about, supplier relationship management when it comes to, hey, your availability and cycle time for XYZ product, this manufacturer product is X. What's going on? Helping, but I guess at the same time you were talking about during COVID is source of origin. Where was that actual part or product actually made, if not in the U.S. or even in the U.S.? Was that one plant going through some horrible times like the BD plant in Western North Carolina last fall after Hurricane Helene? Saline bags were at a shortage, and hospitals
That's
were
right.
begging and pleading and trying to barter or bribe whatever it was to get those bags. That's so it sounds like we've got a lot of different things that you could look at from that perspective. Um, so Nick, I guess we've definitely focused on a lot in the Takeda space, and Todd, thank you for illustrating that for us.
Mhm.
Where else? So Tammy had asked also, and it's a good segue into the next topic I was hoping to bring up is talk about in the pharma world and the R&D labs there within pharma. Are we, where exactly, where else are you seeing a lot companies kind of look to Labviva to solve their problems aside from the
Yeah.
R&D labs?
Yeah, I think that the next space that we're kind of pushing towards is actually the quality control and the manufacturing business units within large pharma, in terms of like some of the same similar issues that we're seeing in R&D. It's, lack of access and visibility into their master data. It's actually increased pressure for making sure they have a resilient supply chain, and overall better access to analytics and understanding what's going on, who they're purchasing with, where from, what is the demand and forecasting. All those kind of pieces actually get elevated as we go down sort of the into the GMP space in the R&D world.
Mm-hmm. How about, I guess you said you were looking into you're looking into academia as well. Where are you seeing some interest germinating from there?
Yeah, in the academia world, it's fairly interesting as we think about Labviva's presence. We're in a number of the top R1 research institutions. We started working with them over 5 years ago, and in the academic space, what we've seen is that we started off really focusing in the R&D categories, but Labviva as a technology itself, we really can just manage catalogs, any sort of commodity items on our platform. And we're starting to see significant, expansion within other categories. So as we think about like office supplies, as we think about MRO services, as we think about, computer purchasing, those are actually all going through Labviva. We're even seeing things like drug supply, like the McKessons of the world, where you have this sort of dynamic similar in the R&D space, where you have large distributors that own sort of the majority of the spend, similar to Todd described in that 80-20 rule. You have direct manufacturers, and then you have smaller distributors. And really, you can apply the same logic in those spaces by using a neutral party like a Labviva to both manage your purchasing as well as your inventory. And one of the other pieces that we haven't talked about yet is, if you are going to displace a vendor managed inventory model, it's also you need a neutral third party inventory supplier to actually do the inventory themselves.
Yeah, that they definitely tends to be a bias. I mean, you have companies like Regis that are RGIS that can come in there and do wall-to-wall inventory, but at least having some of those preliminary documents as a basis for them to be able to do wall-to-wall, I could see how there could be a really good use case.
Exactly. Exactly.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like we were able to, Tammy, I hope we were able to answer your question there. That it sounds like if you're going with the McKessons and Cardinals and Sencoras of the world for actual finished goods, then looking at catalogs that way and planning sounds like it's another application that you're seeing in the market.
Yes,
Yep.
that was helpful.
Great, great. Well, I guess for those of us like me, I'm going to admit, my career has been more in supply chain, warehousing, transportation world, but a few others. What's a good, like, how could we learn a little bit more, or how do you feel like how can we what lessons can we learn through the Labviva and this lab supply story?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is just really just having a good understanding of typically, in all these different categories, the VMI model is used to really make it easier for replenishment, to avoid stock out, to de-risk your supply chain, and also from an ease of use perspective of having reliance on one, typically one primary distributor. What
Mm-hmm.
we've seen though is there's a lot of opaqueness with that model. And as you kind of dig in and try to better understand more about your data, more about your purchasing, more about your supply chain, it really is what was illuminating and working with, Takeda and Todd, and understanding how much customers don't really know about how much they're paying for a particular SKU. What is their actual demand in terms of what they're purchasing, and how that changes on a year-to-year basis, especially as we see about the R&D world. So as I think about sort of like takeaways and lessons learned, I think the first step in all this is getting ownership of your data. I think that's key and primary point number one, especially as you're evaluating these models. The second thing is you really need to understand, especially with the distributors and vendors that you work with, what are the incentives, and making sure these incentives are aligned. And this starts with a contract. So, some of these models that are put into place where it's a volume-based discount or these rebates, you really need to lift underneath the curtain and understand how do those models work and how are they incentivized. And the third thing is that I would say as a takeaway is really, as you look at sort of some of these distribution models, there's almost a necessity that it needs to be neutral from a people, a process, and a technology perspective. And a lot of these distributors are trying to own all three layers because it plays into their advantage, and ultimately it drives pretty significant costs to the buyer.
Yeah, because there's hidden costs for freight, Incoterms, handling charges, that sort of thing, most likely. So I hear you
Exactly.
correctly.
Exactly.
Where do you guys are you seeing? Well, we've got Labviva now in the market. Are you seeing other players like Labviva emerging as well?
Yeah, we've seen people focus on the inventory piece, and we've seen people focus on the purchasing piece. We haven't really seen many players that combine both together. And what I mean by that is having a purchasing technology that is connected to your inventory so that you can see real time what's available in your own internal inventory, and then what's available commercially within the market with the suppliers that you work with. And those connections we haven't really seen yet because, quite frankly, it's very hard to do. It takes co-development with, a person like Todd and a company like Takeda that's willing to invest in a technology company to develop something that is really, fit for purpose and designed for a large organization like a Takeda.
Okay, so it sounds like, if I hear you though correctly, it sounds like the standard catalog management, purchasing and catalog management firms out there aren't yet getting into I mean, they've got it in some ways, but it sounds like Labviva is really trying to differentiate itself specifically in the healthcare and R&D niche.
Yeah, that's where we see a lot of, open area for us. I think we are, like we said previously, like we're expanding our category use cases in higher ed just because there's less resourcing to support those large institutions. They don't have large supply chain procurement teams to handle, the diversity of spend that they have. So they're looking for a technology solution that is like a full stop solution to enable those teams. So we're seeing a lot of sort of expansion in that area. As we think about like other companies, again, we're primarily focused in R&D, but the technology can be applied to other categories, other verticals where there's a commoditized product, there's distributors, and then there's inventory that needs to be done.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So we've got amongst those that I'm seeing in our listing here, we've got folks from education, but also from the facilities management and commercial and healthcare cleaning, the janitorial space, but they need to make sure that the clean rooms are truly clean and using the right products that won't cause any adverse events from happening in those labs as well. So it sounds like, and then also other CROs and CDMOs on the call as well. So it sounds like sounds like what Labviva's offering could benefit all of them.
Yeah.
At that perspective. Well, this is awesome. Where is Labviva? Where is Labviva now? Is it just are your clients primarily US, or are you seeing some international interest now developing too?
Yeah, so our growth has primarily been with large pharma. So a lot of our customers are based, they have US headquarters, but there's a lot of different sites across the world that are using the Labviva technology. Primarily in Europe, we're seeing a large expansion. And then the next place that we're going to is actually Asia and in the Japanese market specifically.
Sure. Well, Takeda.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep.
No, where have you seen have you had some lessons learned in the implementation of what we in procurement could do better in trying to bring on someone like Labviva? We talk a lot about in our procurement worlds of tech adoption or stakeholder adoption as one of them. We know that, but has there been an example where it didn't go as great, and what did you learn? What did you and what did your client learn from that?
Yeah, I think
go for it.
I can speak to that a little bit when you're done. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, just really quickly, Todd. I think a couple things. I think whenever partnering with a technology firm, change management is key. I think change management with your supply base and the vendors that you work with is imperative for something like a Labviva to be implemented properly, and having communication and joint communication that, this isn't, Labviva trying to push a new way of working. This is something that the client wants, and having that sponsorship at an executive level and making sure there's clear communication that, hey, we are going to implement this technology. It's going to provide better visibility for us as a customer, but also for you as a supplier, I think is vital in a lot of these technology rollouts. I think making sure that, for the stakeholders that are using the technology, that they understand the reasoning for why. And there will be hurdles with any technology implementation. Change is, difficult for anyone. So I think clearly communicating and having the resources for those teams to adopt a new technology is very critical. And that's a key lesson learned. And then 3 is like, for our purchasing technology, being able to shut down those other buying channels so that we see the adoption, right? As you think about your typical punch out catalog, people are used to working in those environments, right? And it's almost becomes like a no-brainer situation where they go to their punch out with whatever supplier vendor that they want to work with, and then they just purchase. What we're fundamentally doing as part of change management is we're actually shutting down those tiles and those punch out catalogs. So we have one catalog, which is Labviva, And then you have all the different punch out availabilities and catalogs within our environment so that you're constantly cost checking on every single SKU you're purchasing.
Wow.
Todd, I know you wanted to jump in. Anything else that you would want to add there?
Just a couple little things. I mean, Nick, I think you covered it really brilliantly. I would say by doing this, it's a wonderful opportunity for those of us in the procurement profession that are looking for something new and different and are excited about trying to make an impact to your organization. You can make an enormous impact to your organization. What it requires is leadership, right? And you may find that you have more leadership capability than you think you do if you put some grit behind it, right? Put your back into it, if you will, and go on it. And at a certain point, I just decided that I wasn't going to let any of these internal hurdles or politics or anything else really bother me. So I just created a strategy. I went after it. And I did a tremendous amount of communication with people, both internally and externally, to get funding. I mean, I never had a budget that I was managing, but yet ultimately, there was money that needed to be spent in order to get us ready to do this, both from a technology standpoint, but also the neutral services that we brought along to do a lot of this work at Takeda. And it was a great learning and growing experience. So I'd say embrace it, understand there will always be challenges. You just have to figure out how to overcome them. And then sometimes if you have a certain person that's blocking you, you just find other avenues, right? Because there's enough benefits that different parts of the organization really get out of this, that if you keep working it, you'll find people that will be open to the change. And once they realize it, and they may not see it in advance like you do, but once they realize those benefits and you can show them how it works, then they get on board.
Well, it's always hard. You made a great point, Todd. We in procurement don't have a budget. We're out there to try to save money, right? And try to prevent those monies to go out the door. That's our job. And oftentimes asking for investment can be difficult, but having to put together, we ourselves have to be then those asking for those business cases for that investment, like like Labviva or some of our other, pick a catalog or technology or an e-sourcing platform and whatnot. Yeah, that's a very good insight. We could probably even do a whole training on just that, how to sell those business cases to our CPOs.
Yeah. If you want to hear more, I'd be happy to come back. I did a lot of that work. No, but I had to sell it into, I started with my management, and then, that was great. And but they didn't move the needle for me, right? And then I went to finance, and, I started to get some traction and some early wins with finance. And then later on, I had to go into the operations group to control the budget and convince them. So I was able to convince them. And then later on, I had some people, things drying up a little bit for me in the operations group, just personalities and differences of opinion on a few things. So then I moved over into our digital and data group, which was not even there when I started this project. And,
wow.
And then I convinced them that, hey, this is a good thing, and who should manage this budget? And I said, you guys should manage this budget. They're like, okay, we can take that on, right? So we did that. And then, I worked with the manufacturing people and the people in QC, and then told them some of the benefits they could get and showed leadership there, and they bought into it. So that was just little old me. I'm not a professional speaker, as you can all tell by this conversation today, but it worked. But you've got to have some perseverance and some grit, and you got to want to make a difference. And if you find that passion within yourself, there's amazing things you can do. And I've had the great opportunity to work with Nick Premnath for a number of years now. And he's also helped me, step by step to do things that are transformative for the company. So it's been a great experience. I encourage all of you to try it, whether it's this or some other major initiative. That's where you're really going to get the learning and the ability to build and manage your career moving forward.
How did you deal with adoption? Did you end up finding a few test cases that could be kind of your influencers or ambassadors?
Yes. So there were a number of different ways that occurred. So sometimes people just simply needed training. And then once you showed them, and then they could see, the great thing is they can see the savings on each transaction that they do. And
Oh,
so they
wow.
know how much they're saving. So it's actually visible in the platform, and it's also visible in reporting in an aggregate level, right? And we initially did a pilot program with 100 scientists, and we got the scientists' feedback about what do they like about working with the Labviva tool, what didn't they like so much. And we fed that information back into the people at Labviva for them to then prioritize enhancements or new capabilities, you know, that the scientists felt they needed. So it really was that whole cycle of innovation was spurred by, in many cases, the scientists at Takeda, as well as, you know, the great minds at Labviva to actually design the product that does what it needs to do. And this was really all a big data problem at the end of the day.
Sure.
Transparency and understanding of your business. And no one in the pharmaceutical environment before we did this really had the opportunity to understand the data as well as I was fortunate enough to be able to do. And that made a big difference in terms of plotting the course forward.
Okay. I want to bring up one last comment and then open up for more questions. It's kind of like the big elephant in the room. A lot of universities and a lot of R1 universities at level and a lot of funding at the US government level seems to be drying up and strapping resources. And having worked in big pharma at CSL, our Securus group is the second largest in flu manufacturer in the world. And of course, that being a vaccine, it's going to become interesting. I'll just say it that way. Where are you, from Labviva's perspective, this year so far? Maybe it's too early to say, but what are you seeing as a result of the current public policy situation?
Yeah, I think for the majority of the academic universities that we're working with, we haven't really seen a significant downtrend in spend through our platform in terms of year over year sort of metrics. There is concern though from our, stakeholders within those institutions around, budgetary cuts of like sort of what's coming. I think with the universities that we're working with, they all have very large endowments that they can ride out sort of like the storm.
Right.
But they do feel sort of the pressure. But from a data perspective, we actually haven't seen any like drop in the amount of spend that's going through our platform.
Okay.
In the pharmaceutical world, I think there's obviously government funding that they have that they use for some of their R&D expenditure. We
Right.
haven't seen a ton of impact on that side either. So overall, as we look at like our data set, which is, a glimpse of the world,
Right.
there isn't a ton of impact for either segments that we primarily serve.
Do you think it's too early to tell, or do you think you got enough and data to be able to see trends?
I think we have enough data to see like the near-term impact. Now, the longer-term impact for, I think, more on the academic side, I think the story is still out to be told, especially for some of these smaller institutions that we work with.
Sure. Okay. Well, this is really helpful. Don't think I haven't seen any new questions come up. But maybe we can probably just go with some parting thoughts at this point. As procurement and supply management, so our organization, as you know, ISM doesn't just look at procurement, but we have to look at supply management. We look at macroeconomic data through the report on business that gets published once a month. We interact with the Federal Reserve and international economic institutions as well, just to make sure that we can intelligently talk through our reasons for our sourcing strategy or advise our stakeholders. What advice do you, what kind of advice do you would you like to share with us as procurement folks going forward as we look at macro trends and look at where Labviva is going?
Yeah, I think again, like what Labviva is trying to do fundamentally is provide and shine a flashlight across all the organizations that we work with on their data, right? A lot of the data is owned by the distributors and it's hidden on purpose to mask costs and, you know, mask some of the waste that is quite frankly across, you know, as I see the academic and R&D world, across the entire industry. So from a, you know, procurement and supply chain perspective, one of the things that I encourage all people to do is really get a hold and ownership of your data. If you can't report out on that dynamically, you don't know what you're purchasing, you don't know who you're purchasing with, that is a problem. Specifically as we see like this vendor managed inventory model that is used, you know, ubiquitously across many different verticals. It's a very dangerous game. You almost have the fox guarding the hen house, right? And as we kind of co-developed this with Todd and the Takeda team, it was really, really illuminating once they got a hold of their data. And I'm sure Todd can speak to this more of, you know, how that impacted their strategy. And what Labviva is fundamentally trying to do is enable you know, your procurement and supply chain strategy using technology as a neutral party and as an agnostic player.
Hey, Todd, also for you for maybe some parting thoughts is, and if you could kind of mix in the element, the two letters that everybody loves these days is AI. As far as procurement, as procurement practitioners, as well being asked to come up with new technology, even AI empowered tools, like we heard that Labviva is starting to get into. What kind of words of wisdom would you be willing to share with us today?
Well, I think you know, the whole topic of AI, I won't say that, pretend I'm an expert in all aspects of it, right? But technology, we all know, you know, if you look on the internet or the TV or anything, you know, right, you hear about AI everywhere, right? So I think AI is going to fundamentally change a lot of different business processes and make significant improvements over time. Now, it takes time for this to go through. First, you've got to have the hardware and the technology, and then software companies got to figure out, how do I optimize this to solve real world business problems? And I think you're going to see things like, you know, in more in your area, right? So you're going to see some fully automated warehouses, I think, at certain points, right? Where you've got robots, you already have that, but you're going to have robots, you know, in those different environments performing most of the functions, right? And you're having a much better understanding of the data, the movement of these products through the supply chain. It's going to be a very exciting time. So I think we all have to not be afraid of it, but lean into it a little bit and learn what you can. Doesn't mean you need to have to, you know, you have to figure out how to program this stuff, right? But I think learning to use these tools is going to be more and more important in our profession over time. And what we've used like the Labviva technology for, amongst other things, is to have better, improved relationships with our suppliers. If you look at somebody like myself and the role I was in, I probably had, give or take, 2,000 global or different suppliers supporting the entire supply chain for a global organization. How do you manage that? Right? The answer is you can't really manage that effectively, not in the normal traditional one-to-one relationships, right? So you've got to start, you either have to only focus on the top, you know, a couple handfuls of companies, right? And do the best you can there, you know, your typical 80-20 rule, or you have to find technologies and other ways to help automate some of these processes to help you search through and understand your business and be able to execute at a higher level than you could before. And that's where technology is going to help us from a productivity perspective, right, over time. And that's, you know, what it's really all about in some respects. And so I think that pay attention to these things. And then I'll just tell you a couple of really cool tidbits about, you know, little features, not major things necessarily, but little features that Labviva has just to kind of pique your interest, which I found interesting. And one is, in the early days, we said, okay, we're great when we want to buy a product that's clearly listed in a catalog and we have that data set, right, available through Labviva. What about those cases where people, they don't know exactly what they're looking for? right? They have a general idea, but they don't know exactly. They don't have a part number they're going to search up to find it, right? The data's all out there, but how do they do that? So I worked with the Labviva people, and again, they did all the heavy lifting, but we worked on a tool where people could start to use natural language, right? And start to type in different things. So you could type into the tool things like a Corning cell culture flask, and all these flasks will start coming up, right? And then you can define that further and say, oh, I want one with that angled neck and this and that and the other thing, right? And it'll continue to search through that data to help you find that product, even though you didn't know the part number or you didn't really have the totally correct description. And that's all done with technology, right? And AI and things of that nature. So that's one of the neat things they do. Another really cool feature they have is, if you think about this, the old world was, I manage one or two catalogs. Okay, so people say, okay, for office supplies, I go to Office Depot, we'll say. For laboratory supplies, maybe I go to Fisher, and for chemicals, I go somewhere else, or whatever it might be. And they have three catalogs to manage. That's relatively simple, right? And a punch in, punch out technology works okay for that. But that's not what we did ultimately at Takeda, right? So we had, 80 plus catalogs, and then we had about 25 specialized in chemicals, and then we started going global, right? So then we had catalogs in foreign languages and things of that nature in Europe, right? Other layers of complexity. So how do you determine which catalog you should search into to find what you need? Once you've gone beyond a couple of catalogs, you can't do it. So you're going to miss all these opportunities to both find the product you want, as well as find it in an optimal cost structure. So that's where Labviva would help tremendously, because it automatically searches all those catalogs at the same time, bringing up those results. And so I don't know what the data set is now, but literally we had over 20 million items across these different catalogs that we could search. And think of the technology and how fast it has to be able to do that basically instantaneously to come up with your results. So it's really pretty fabulous to have tools like that versus the old style tools that we've all grown up with.
Well, you can get I'm already feel like I need to get a nap if I'm thinking about having to look through all those individual catalogs myself for the same thing. I mean, I'd probably throw my hands up after half an hour if I were a lab tech, to be honest. Well, and like you said, the pace of the cycle time of getting to that answer reduced by an enormous amount. High percentage points definitely enhances that user experience, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And then, the last thing I would say is also in a research environment, even if I could take that snapshot of what do I need today, in a month, what those researchers need is not the same thing as today. It continues to change. And the churn we would see on average, every company I worked at and did this kind of role, churn would be about 40% per year. So even if I negotiated my best pricing with a supplier, at time zero, after 1 year, I'm only buying 60% of what I negotiated. And then after the second year, it goes down by the same math factor again. So 3 years later, you're buying almost totally different things than you were buying before. Well, typically these lab supplies distributors, that's a 5-year contract. So how do you even negotiate a good contract? I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but the answer is you can't negotiate a perfect contract for that. So having this transparency of the data helps you drive through. And different companies may have different strategies on how they want to price you in the marketplace. You can look there and find, who's going to treat you the best at any given time for any kind of product that you're really looking for in these areas. And that's where it becomes so valuable over time. And it becomes such a no-brainer after the fact that we did all this. But initially, you had to talk through a lot of conversations, right, to get people to be aligned and on the objectives.
Well, hey, I took down some notes. I'm going to get a cramp in my hand from all the scribbling on my side, but I want to thank you both. This was really, it's an area within procurement that we don't often think about. I think a lot of us think about the indirect side, or we think about IT or procurement technology and spend data and tailspin and all that fun stuff. But really appreciate us being able to narrow down into a very specific yet meaningful area, such as lab supplies and R&D. So on behalf of ISM Carolinas, Virginia, thank you so very much for all the great insights here. I really appreciate the insights you've had, and I appreciate everyone who attended today. I hope that you all, like I said, I hope now that the afternoon's here, I hope you're able to go grab a sandwich if you waited while we were talking here. But please look out for new events here from ISM Carolinas, Virginia, and from ISM. Again, thank you very much, and to Todd and Nick, you've been great partners today. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thanks all.